This is not a video about JK Rowling. However, we are going to have to start with her in order to have this conversation. A little while ago, I released a video detailing a breakdown and my thoughts on some of JK Rowling's more recent actions, statements, and expressed thoughts. And if you aren't familiar with that video, you can see it there. Again, you don't necessarily have to because this video is not actually about JK Rowling. However, there was something that happened repeatedly in my comment section and something that I also saw happening on Twitter that I want to talk about. And I'm going to use the response to that JK Rowling video in order to frame this conversation. So, very briefly, JK Rowling is a beloved children's author of the Harry Potter franchise. And as a result, her work means a great deal to a great many people. Over the last over 2 years now, she has been demonstrating a very high degree of active transphobia, not only expressing her own transphobic thoughts, but also platforming, boosting, financially supporting other transphobic organizers, events, groups, creators, etc. Again, I'm not trying to break down all of this, but the reason I bring that up is because that is something that upset a great deal of people. Not just people who have an issue with anyone being transphobic, but a great number of her fans. Because Harry Potter, being a story about someone who felt like an outcast, who felt like they did not belong, finding a place where he finally fit in, yeah, that spoke to a pretty large number of queer people, including trans people. And it's been difficult for a lot of them. But the way some of them appear to be trying to process this is by examining or attempting to examine Ms. Rowling's mental health. I have seen it as both something that is presented as maybe some kind of explanation and maybe we shouldn't be as hard on her because commenters will claim that she appears to be having some kind of mental health issue. There are those who are not using it as any kind of defense, but are still pointing to it as if it explains the degree of her actions and the things that she's saying. That is what I want to talk about. This go-to of mental health as an attempt to explain the actions of a public figure. There are two major things that I want to cover here. The first is that unless the public figure in question has disclosed information about their mental health or any possible mental illness that they are currently or have historically been dealing with, then that is absolutely none of your business at all. Some public figures have talked about their mental health. That's something that's been in the conversation with someone like Kanye West. But with Ms. Rowling, she has not made any comments along that. And someone's mental health, if they have not shared information about that, is not any of your business at all. There are multiple reasons for this. The first is you are not a clinical psychologist. You are not a psychiatrist. You are not in a position to actually diagnose her with anything. You are someone with a pop culture understanding, at best, of various mental conditions, or maybe even base it off your own experience with mental illness, but you are not qualified to diagnose her or anyone with any mental condition. And before anyone attempts to write in a comment, well, I actually have a background, or I am a practicing psychiatrist, or whatever else, if that is the case, then you are unethical and should not be allowed to practice any kind of medicine. Because if you actually have that education, if you actually have that background, then you should understand how unethical it is to attempt to diagnose a person you do not know and have never sat down, had a session with, or even read the detailed notes of someone who has. And yeah, I am flat out calling any and every supposed expert who has ever showed up on a news show to diagnose a celebrity or political figure with a mental health condition unethical. There's a reason that pretty much all of those people are either professors or they are authors or they're not currently practicing, because it's not ethical for them to diagnose someone they do not know. So that is the first thing. Whether or not JK Rowling or anyone who has not disclosed their own mental health information has a mental illness or not is none of your business. Absolutely not. Not even slightly. So that's the first really big problem. But for a moment, let's move past that and take on board, okay, so maybe she has a mental health condition. Maybe she has had some event or some breakdown or some sort of change within her mental state that has caused her to either believe the things that she believes or to express them in the way she chooses to express them. To what degree does that actually matter? And I mean that very sincerely. Why does it matter in the case of someone like this? In the case of someone whose actions and continued platforming and bolstering of deeply harmful thoughts, ideas, and policies, does it matter if they're doing it for mental health reasons? Because whether or not that's true has no bearing on the damage that is being done by her actions. Whether it is because she's acting on sincerely held beliefs or it's because she has early onset dementia, her actions, what she is doing, is just as damaging. It is no less damaging for having a different cause than a sincerely held belief. Why does it matter? And I'm not just asking that as a rhetorical. I intend to address that. Because people appear to be doing this, floating these ideas, these armchair diagnoses, as a way, in some manner, of not having to address something. Now, exactly what that could be might vary. I suspect for some people, especially fans for whom Harry Potter is important to them, maybe even still, and to be clear, I've said before, I don't begrudge anyone continuing to love Harry Potter, especially any Harry Potter-related items that they already owned. I do still take issue with anyone who puts money towards anything with her name on it from this point on and going forward. But I don't think you have to get rid of the Harry Potter stuff you already had. I haven't. It's packed away. It's in the attic. I don't want to look at it. I haven't had the heart to get rid of mine. I do understand that. But I fear that people with that degree of attachment, of nostalgia, of love for her work, they want a reason to not have to think that the person who made something that they love has awful thoughts and is doing awful things. They want there to be a reason that doesn't impact the work. And if, in theory, JK Rowling came down with something over the last 3 years, that would detach her current actions from the person who wrote those books. I understand the impulse to do that. But there's no evidence to support it. And your desire to not want the person now speaking out and taking such action against trans people as JK Rowling is doing to be the same person who wrote books that mean so much to you, your desire to have them be different people doesn't make it so. And it can't. And that can be very hard to cope with. There's a certain amount of guilt that can hit as a result of that. As you find yourself wondering, this person, if something didn't happen that made them like this, then to some degree, they were always like this, or they at least always had the potential to become this on their own. What does that say about me that I like their work? What does that say about me that I couldn't detect that something was off? And while that sense of guilt, I think, is very human, it's also not your responsibility to have noticed these things. But your own emotions and thoughts might still try and hold you in some way responsible. And in a case like that, wanting it to be a mental illness can be a defense mechanism. I went through this earlier to a certain degree with Mel Gibson. Not that I deeply loved everything the man ever did, but Braveheart was one of my favorite movies ever. And then the kind of person Mel Gibson was became very, very evident. And looking back over the years, I now realize that's who he always was. And it makes things uncomfortable. It's not a fun thing to think, he didn't become this, he was always this. And I didn't see it. But again, rationally, it wasn't my responsibility. Braveheart came out in the mid-90s. I was a teenager. How was I supposed to know? It doesn't have to be rational to still weigh on you. I do understand that. But there is no indication of mental illness with her. But even beyond something like that, to make another comparison, and I don't think I can not make this comparison. When I see people diagnosing her with something, another thing that can be an impact of that, and probably an unintended one, is that it removes the responsibility of societal influences or the systems of celebrity and empowerment of capitalism or any other system from having any degree of responsibility. If JK Rowling has a mental illness, then what's going on is nobody's fault. It is not the fault of her fans for sticking beside her and empowering her and praising her as perfect and flawless and going after anyone who said that maybe Harry Potter wasn't the best thing ever and contributing to boosting her ego and reassuring her, no, you're not wrong. You're great. You're awesome. You're wonderful. Which is something I did a video about some years back. To say that it's mental illness removes the responsibility of the groups that she is associating with. And if it removes any responsibility from those groups, then it removes any responsibility of the political system that those groups are attempting to influence. The political system that is allowing her voice to actively push the needle in favor of transphobia in the UK, which is subsequently influencing active transphobia elsewhere, including in the US. If she's mentally ill, then we don't have to examine anything else. All we have to do is get a diagnosis, figure out what's wrong with her, or even if we can't, we just go, well, you can't fix crazy. And that's true. But crazy doesn't exist in a vacuum. Crazy shouldn't be able to do the kind of damage and continued harm that JK Rowling is doing unless there are other failures elsewhere. Unless there is a failure of the defense of human rights. Unless there is a failure of a political system to guard itself against the farthest and most hostile fringe elements within its own population. If she's just crazy, then there's no work to be done. We don't have to worry about anybody else. We don't have to do anything else. And as crass as this comparison may be, it is like how every time there is a mass shooting in the US, those who don't want to deal with gun legislation immediately jump to mental illness. Because if a mass shooter is crazy, then, well, you can't fix crazy, so there's nothing to be done. We don't have to change the system that allowed this to be as damaging as it was. Now, am I accusing JK Rowling of having the same impact as a mass shooter? No, I am not doing that. As I said, this video is not even truly about her. This is about the inclination towards people, anybody, to jump towards mental illness for any reason Whether it's because you're doing it because you need some explanation because it doesn't make any sense to you otherwise, whether you're doing it in order to avoid any kind of responsibility that might be on the part of things other than this one individual, that maybe those things need addressing, whatever it may be, it's still none of your business. And it's also not relevant. It's not relevant to the damage that is happening. And it obscures other problems to suggest that that is what is going on. And the other thing, the very simple fact, and this is something that I think really needs to be remembered about any time anybody is behaving in a way that makes no sense to you. And that is that you don't need a mental illness to be a bad person. You can be a massively influential transphobic person. You don't need a mental illness to be that. You can be a white supremacist who picks up a gun and shoots the people that they believe is making the country worse without having mental illness. Some people are just assholes, and they don't need a mental illness for that to be the case. So please, in my comments specifically, going forward, in reference to JK Rowling or anyone else that has not publicly disclosed some degree of mental illness or struggles with mental health, don't diagnose them in my comments. Don't distract from what's actually going on. And if you feel an inclination to do that even outside my comment section, stop and think why. Why do you care? Why does it matter? Why do you want it to be mental illness? Ask yourself those questions. And hopefully we can move forward. Thank you for listening. This was a fairly frustrated ramble from me, but this has been on my mind for a little bit now, and I needed to get this off my chest. Patreon is how you can support me and what I do. Any amount that you are able to support is of immense assistance, and there are various perks for doing so. There's also a link to the Patreon down in the description. There are links to other things that I do besides this YouTube channel. But don't worry too much about that. Comments down below, like, share, subscribe. Any comments, keep them respectful. No personal attacks against me, other commenters, JK Rowling, or anyone else. But the thing that I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful. You are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. End of the video, so I gotta shout out my top patrons. Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfulla, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Angus Bjarnason, Melinda Walters, Imudelki, Leotha Boyd, Katoria, Toy Lowly, Becky Sparks, Fernambulax the Poodle, Zach, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Tim Price, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Shayla Gourlay, and Brendan LaRose. Thanks for your support. If you want to hear me probably mispronounce your name as well, check out the rewards on the Patreon. How you doing there?